The moment Emily Carter realized she had destroyed her marriage was not loud. There were no shattered plates, no screaming accusations, no dramatic exits. Just a quiet kitchen in the early morning. Her husband standing by the counter, holding her phone in his hand. And the look in his eyes, not anger, not even hatred, but the slow, unbearable realization that the woman he trusted most in the world had chosen someone else. That silence would haunt Emily for the rest of her life. The marriage that slowly fell silent. On a grey October morning in Seattle, Emily Carter stood at the kitchen sink, watching the rain slide down the glass like slow tears. Seattle had always been a city that lived under clouds, but lately it felt as if the weather had followed her inside. Behind her, the house moved through its familiar rhythm. The coffee machine hummed. The refrigerator clicked softly. Upstairs, the faint sound of Lucas's alarm went off for the third time. Emily dried her hands on a dish towel and glanced at the clock. 7:02 a.m. "Lucas!" she called. No response. She sighed. From the dining table, Michael sat hunched over his laptop, already dressed for work in a crisp blue shirt. His coffee sat untouched beside him, while lines of cold reflected faintly on his glasses. "Did you wake him up?" she asked. Michael didn't look up. Emily leaned against the counter. "You said that yesterday too." Another pause. "I check on him." But he didn't move. After 12 years of marriage, Emily had learned to read the spaces between Michael's words. They had once filled entire evenings talking about everything: books, movies, stupid office gossip, dreams about traveling somewhere warm. Now most conversations existed in fragments: logistics, schedules, bills. She walked upstairs and knocked on Lucas's door. "Lucas, seriously." "School." A groan came from inside. 5 minutes. "You said that 20 minutes ago." Silence. She opened the door anyway. Lucas lay sprawled across the bed, his dark hair covering half his face, one arm hanging toward the floor where his phone glowed with a late-night TikTok video. Emily smiled faintly. Teenagers were universal. "Up," she said, putting the curtains open. The grey daylight flooded the room. Lucas squinted. "Mom, come on, you're going to be late." He sat up reluctantly, rubbing his eyes. "Is Dad still working already?" Emily hesitated. "Yeah." Lucas made a face. "Does he ever stop?" Emily didn't answer. Downstairs, Michael was still at the table when she returned. Same posture, same screen glow. "You're going to be late," she said gently. "I know," but he kept typing. Emily poured herself coffee and sat across from him. For a moment she simply watched him. Michael Carter had once been the most animated person she knew. When they met in college, he talked with his hands, laughed loudly, pulled her into spontaneous midnight drives. Now he looked like someone slowly disappearing into his own life. "Hey," she said. "Yeah? Do you remember that little restaurant in Portland?" Michael finally looked up. "What restaurant?" "The Italian one we found on that road trip, the place with the violin player." He frowned, thinking, then shrugged. "Not really." Emily smiled weakly. "It was our anniversary." "Oh." He returned to his laptop. The small world landed between them like something fragile breaking. For the rest of breakfast, neither of them spoke. Emily's office sat on the 7th floor of a publishing building downtown. Stacks of manuscripts covered her desk, some brilliant, most mediocre. Being an editor meant living inside other people's stories, while quietly ignoring the missing chapters in your own. At noon, her co-worker Sandra Lopez leaned against the doorway. "Lunch?" Emily looked up from her screen. "Please." They walked to a cafe across the street, where the smell of roasted coffee beans filled the warm air. Sandra studied her over the menu. "You look tired." "Late reading," Emily said. Sandra raised an eyebrow. "Or late thinking?" Emily laughed softly. "You know me too well." They ordered salads and sat by the window. Outside, people rushed through the drizzle with umbrellas and headphones. "Marriage check," Sandra said suddenly. Emily groaned. "That sounds like a medical exam." "Humor me." Emily traced her fork through the lettuce. "It's fine." Sandra didn't respond. "Fine?" she asked. "That's your word?" Emily hesitated. "Fine. Not happy, not terrible, just existing." "He's busy," Emily said finally. "His company is launching something big." Sandra leaned back. "Emily, people have busy jobs. That doesn't mean they stop seeing their spouse." Emily looked down. "It's not like that. But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if it was true. That evening, the Carter house returned to its routine. Lucas shut himself in his room with homework and video games. Michael worked late in the home office. Emily sat alone in the living room with a book she wasn't really reading. The house felt too quiet. At 9:47 p.m., Michael walked into the kitchen for water. She looked up. "You're still working?" "Almost done." He opened the fridge. Emily watched him for a moment. "Do you ever miss before?" she asked. He paused. "Before what?" "Before everything got so busy." Michael closed the fridge slowly. "I'm doing this for us, Em." "I know." But that wasn't what she meant. He touched her shoulder briefly as he passed. A polite gesture. The kind you give someone you care about. But not the kind that makes your heart race. Emily sat there long after he went back upstairs. Somewhere deep inside her chest, a quiet loneliness was growing. She didn't know yet that in a few weeks, someone else would notice it. And that single moment of being seen would change everything. A few weeks later, on a cold Thursday evening, Emily found herself standing alone in a quiet art gallery in downtown Seattle. She almost hadn't come. Sandra had insisted, forwarding her an invitation to a small photography exhibition and texting, "You need to leave your house for something that isn't groceries or manuscripts." The gallery was softly lit, the walls lined with large black and white photographs. City streets after rain, empty train platforms, strangers caught in fleeting moments of emotion. The room hummed with quiet conversation and the clinking of wine glasses. Emily moved slowly from one photograph to another, her coat still wrapped around her as if she wasn't entirely sure she belonged there. One photograph stopped her. It showed a woman sitting alone at a diner counter at midnight. The fluorescent light above her made the loneliness in the scene almost tangible. The woman wasn't crying, wasn't dramatic, just staring at her untouched coffee like someone waiting for a life that had taken a different turn. "Most people think it's about isolation," a man's voice said beside her. Emily turned. He was tall, somewhere in his early 40s, with slightly messy dark hair and the kind of relaxed confidence that didn't seem forced. A camera hung loosely from his shoulder. "But it's actually about recognition," he continued. Emily glanced back at the photograph. "What do you mean?" "The moment when someone realizes they've been invisible for a long time." She felt something in her chest tighten. "That's oddly specific." He smiled faintly. "I took the picture." Emily blinked. "Oh." He extended a hand. "Adrian Blake." Emily Carter. His handshake was warm, easy. For a moment they stood there quietly, both looking at the photograph again. "You noticed the expression before the setting," Adrian said. "Most people talk about the lighting." "I work with stories," Emily replied. "I tend to look for what people aren't saying." Adrian studied her for a brief moment, long enough to make her slightly self-conscious. "Then you probably saw something most people miss." "What's that?" He tilted his head slightly. "The woman in the photo isn't alone because no one wants her there." Emily waited. "She's alone because the person who should notice her doesn't anymore." The words landed deeper than she expected. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, Emily felt suddenly understood by a man she had known for less than 2 minutes. And for the first time in a long while, someone was really looking at her. In the days after the exhibition, Emily told herself the encounter meant nothing, just a conversation with a stranger. But 2 days later, by scrolling through the gallery's website during a quiet afternoon at work, she found Adrian Blake's photography page. His images carried the same quiet intensity she had noticed that night, people caught in moments of truth they probably never meant to reveal. Almost without thinking, she followed his social media account. An hour later, a notification appeared. "Adrian Blake followed you back." Emily hesitated before sending the first message. "Your photograph at the diner stayed in my head." She stared at the screen, debating whether to delete it. Then the reply came only minutes later. "That's the best compliment a photographer can get." From there, the conversation unfolded easily. At first it was harmless. Art, books, the strange beauty of rainy cities like Seattle. Adrian had a way of asking questions that made Emily feel seen in a way she hadn't felt for years. Soon, the messages moved later into the evening. While Michael worked upstairs and Lucas shut himself in his room, Emily would sit on the couch with her phone glowing softly in her hands. "Do you always stay up this late?" Adrian asked one night. "Only when I can't sleep," she replied. "And what keeps you awake?" Emily stared at that question longer than she expected. "Life, I guess." Days later, Adrian suggested coffee. Emily almost said no. She told herself it was unnecessary, inappropriate even. But another voice inside her, quiet, curious, kept whispering that it was just a conversation, nothing more. They met at a small cafe near the waterfront. The conversation flowed as easily as it had online. Adrian talked about traveling for photography, about capturing people when they didn't realize they were being seen. "You observe people for a living," Emily said. "And you understand them for a living," he replied. It felt effortless, comfortable, dangerously easy. The second meeting came sooner, then a third. Each time Emily reassured herself that it was harmless. She wasn't hiding anything, she told herself. She just hadn't mentioned it. But one rainy evening after dinner, when the city lights reflected off the wet pavement, they lingered outside the cafe longer than usual. The conversation slowed. The silence between them deepened. Emily felt something fragile and electric hanging in the air. "I should go," she said quietly. Adrian nodded, but neither of them moved. Then, in a moment that felt both sudden and inevitable, the distance between them disappeared, and the line Emily had promised herself she would never cross quietly vanished. The first days after that night felt strangely unreal to Emily. Nothing in her life had visibly changed. The same gray Seattle mornings arrived, the same quiet breakfast table. Michael still worked through emails before finishing his coffee, and Lucas still rushed out the door half awake with his backpack hanging from one shoulder. Yet inside Emily, something had shifted. At first, there had been a rush she couldn't deny, a spark of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Adrian's messages appeared throughout the day like small bursts of warmth. "Thinking about last night. When can I see you again?" Emily would read the words during quiet moments at her desk, her heart beating just a little faster. But that feeling didn't last as long as she expected. Soon, another emotion crept in quietly behind it. Guilt. It appeared in small, uncomfortable ways. When Michael asked if she had a good day, and she answered yes, too quickly. When Lucas told her about a math test, and she realized she had barely listened because she had been thinking about Adrian's last message. When she noticed herself hiding her phone whenever someone entered the room. Emily had never thought of herself as someone capable of deception, yet suddenly her life was filled with small lies, tiny adjustments to the truth that made everything easier. "I'm meeting Sandra after work," she told Michael one evening. In reality, she was meeting Adrian. At the restaurant, Adrian reached across the table and brushed his fingers lightly over her hand. "You look like you're somewhere else," he said gently. Emily forced a smile. "I'm just tired." But the truth was heavier. She wasn't just tired, she was divided. At home, she was a wife and mother trying to preserve the life she had built. With Adrian, she was someone else entirely, someone lighter, freer, more alive. But the longer she lived between those two worlds, the more fragile both of them began to feel. And deep down, Emily knew something dangerous was growing. Because secrets, no matter how carefully protected, always find their way to the surface eventually. The discovery happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Emily had rushed out of the house later than usual, distracted by a last-minute email from her office. In the hurry, she left her phone on the kitchen counter beside her half-finished coffee. Michael didn't notice it at first. He was standing at the sink, rinsing a mug, when the phone vibrated softly against the marble surface. Once, then again. At first, he ignored it, but the screen lit up with a message preview. "Adrian, I keep thinking about Sunday night." Michael frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to him. The phone vibrated again. "Adrian, I miss you already." For a moment, Michael simply stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the words. He told himself it was probably harmless. A coworker, a friend, something explainable. Yet something uneasy settled in his chest. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he picked up the phone. The message thread was already opened from the notification. Only a few lines were visible, fragments of conversation stretching back through the past days. "I wish we had more time together. Last night felt too short. I can still smell your perfume." Michael didn't scroll further. He didn't need to. The meaning was painfully clear. The kitchen suddenly felt too quiet. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Michael placed the phone back on the counter exactly where it had been. Then he sat down at the table, his hands resting loosely together, as if he were trying to hold something fragile that had already slipped away. When Emily returned home that evening, the house felt strangely still. Lucas was upstairs. Michael stood near the kitchen counter, and in his hand was her phone. Emily's stomach tightened immediately. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she whispered, "Michael." He looked at her then. What she expected was anger, shouting, accusations, but what she saw instead was far worse. His eyes weren't furious, they were empty. "I wasn't looking for anything," he said quietly. The calmness in his voice made her chest ache. He just appeared. Emily felt the room spinning slightly. "I can explain," Michael shook his head slowly. "Don't," he said. The word was gentle, but final. He placed the phone on the table between them, and in that quiet kitchen, Emily felt the true weight of what she had done for the very first time. Not the excitement, not the secrecy, but the irreversible fracture of trust that now stood silently between them. The days that followed felt like living inside a house after an earthquake, everything still standing, yet nothing truly intact. Michael didn't shout, he didn't accuse. Instead, he withdrew into a quiet distance Emily had never seen before. They moved through the same rooms like strangers sharing a temporary space. Conversations became brief and mechanical. "Lucas has practice at 5. Okay, I'll pick him up. Fine." The warmth that had once existed between them, even during their distant years, was gone. In its place was a careful politeness that felt colder than anger. Lucas noticed it almost immediately. Teenagers were observant in ways adults often underestimated. One evening at dinner, he looked between them, frowning. "Did something happen?" Emily opened her mouth to answer, but Michael spoke first. "We're just dealing with some things." Lucas nodded slowly, though his eyes lingered on Emily a moment longer. Within weeks, the tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Lucas stopped lingering at the dinner table. He spent more time in his room, headphones on, door half closed. When Emily tried to talk to him one afternoon, he barely looked up from his phone. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "I'm fine," but the distance in his voice mirrored the one growing between her and Michael. Meanwhile, the world Emily had briefly built with Adrian began to fade just as quickly as it had appeared. At first, he sent messages asking how she was holding up. "I'm here if you need to talk." But as the situation grew heavier, talks of separation, therapy, family tension, his replies became shorter, less frequent. One evening, she sent a message she had rewritten 3 times. "I think everything is falling apart." The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. Hours later, a simple reply came. "I'm sorry you're going through this." No invitation to meet, no late-night conversation. Emily stared at the screen long after the message arrived. In the quiet realization settling over her, she understood something painful. The affair had thrived in secrecy and fantasy, but when reality arrived, messy, complicated, heartbreaking, Adrian was no longer part of the story. The months after everything collapsed were the quietest Emily had ever experienced. Not peaceful quiet, the heavy kind. Michael eventually moved into the guest room. They spoke only when necessary, about bills, Lucas's schedule, or practical things that kept the household functioning. The emotional space between them had become vast and unfamiliar. Lucas rarely spoke to her at all. Emily would sometimes find him in the kitchen late at night, grabbing a drink or a snack, but their conversations never lasted more than a few sentences. "How was school?" she asked once. "Fine." "Did you finish your history project?" "Yeah." Then he would disappear back upstairs, leaving the silence behind. The distance hurt more than anger ever could. Eventually, Michael suggested something one evening without looking directly at her. "Maybe we should talk to someone." Emily knew what he meant, a therapist. At first, the sessions felt unbearable. Sitting across from a stranger while Michael calmly explained the betrayal forced Emily to hear her own actions spoken aloud in ways she could no longer soften. Dr. Reynolds, their therapist, asked questions Emily had spent months avoiding. "Why do you think the attention from Adrian mattered so much to you?" Emily didn't answer right away. "Because it made me feel alive again. Because I felt invisible. Because I was lonely." But slowly, through uncomfortable honesty, something deeper began to surface. Her loneliness hadn't appeared overnight. Neither had Michael's distance. Years of quiet neglect, missed conversations, unspoken resentment, and emotional exhaustion had slowly built walls between them. None of that excused what she had done, but it forced her to see the truth more clearly. The affair had not created the fracture in their marriage. It had only shattered the fragile surface hiding it. Outside therapy, Emily began keeping a journal. Page after page filled with thoughts she had never admitted before, about fear, regret, and the painful realization that she had tried to escape her life instead of confronting it. Some nights she cried quietly after everyone had gone to bed. Other nights she simply stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment Michael stood in the kitchen holding her phone. She knew forgiveness, if it ever came, would take years, maybe longer. But for the first time since everything had happened, Emily stopped asking how to fix what she had broken. Instead, she began asking a harder question. How had she become someone capable of breaking it in the first place? Years passed more quietly than Emily had expected. Time did not erase what had happened, but it softened the sharpest edges of it. The house in Seattle eventually changed. Michael moved into a small apartment across the city after the divorce was finalized, though the separation had felt inevitable long before the papers were signed. Lucas left for college 2 years later, carrying with him a complicated mixture of love, disappointment, and distance. Emily remained in the same house for a while, though it often felt too large for one person. She continued therapy long after Michael stopped attending, not because she expected redemption, but because she no longer wanted to run from the truth of who she had been. Her journal slowly filled with reflections about responsibility, regret, and the quiet discipline of becoming better than the person she once was. Years later, on a calm autumn afternoon, Emily stood outside a cafe near the university where Lucas studied. Her hands trembled slightly around the warm paper cup of coffee. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, taller now, older, his expression more guarded than she remembered from his teenage years. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Hi." They sat across from each other, an awkward pause settling between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Emily took a slow breath. "I know I hurt you," she said gently, "and I know I can't undo that." Lucas stared down at the table. "But I want you to know," she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion rising in her chest, "that I'm still trying every day to become someone worthy of being in your life." Lucas didn't respond right away, but after a moment he looked up. The distance in his eyes was still there, but it wasn't as cold as it once had been. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but for Emily it felt like the smallest beginning. And sometimes redemption didn't arrive as a dramatic moment of absolution. Sometimes it began quietly, with the courage to keep showing up, even when you weren't sure you deserved to be there.